I'm Vanessa from Ellie and Mac. Welcome back to my sewing room. I'm so excited. Today is viewer request, and our request comes from a Divine Beetroot, and she needs a more stylish way to have her glasses close to her. So let me show you this free glass case tutorial. As you can tell, it's a little snowy behind me. We're in a blizzard today, but that does not keep us from sewing. So today we're going to take this request from Divine Beetroot and make a really nice glasses case. So I was thinking about different ways to do this. She mentioned a necklace or something that could latch around your waist or some way to protect her glasses but keep them close at hand as she starts a new temp job. And so I was thinking about how we could do that. And I thought, one of the things that we usually have around our necks when we're working, or let's say on a cruise or wherever, is a lanyard. And I've been keeping my keys on the lanyard, and I have to say, I haven't been losing them. So I felt like this would be a great way to add a lanyard to a glasses case and help keep them handy. So let me show you all the details.
So up first, I need to draft the flap. And this one, I want it to be folding over and have sew-on clasps. So I have this piece of paper and it's 4 inches wide by 3 inches tall. And this little rectangle I can then fold in half. And the reason why I'm folding in half is because I want to have both sides of my pattern the same, and I'm going to be cutting 2 pieces of fabric at the same time mirrored. So I really want this to be identical. So here are my sew-on clasps. If you have snaps, you could probably do this a little thinner, but make sure you have seam allowance. And so when I have to draft something, I usually do a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So everything's a little wider. And I did cut wider than I needed to because I knew I could always go back and readjust, whereas I really kind of add. You can see with my sew-on clasp here though, it's a little wide still. So I can put it back on fold and then I can take a 1/4 inch off, and that's going to be about a 1/2 inch reduction total, and so that's going to really help thin it out. But again, you just don't want to take too much. You can even do like a thicker binding and have that come over with your snaps or your sew-on clasp, but I did want to have this curved shape to it to make sure that glasses are extra secure. I'm notorious for dropping my sunglasses, just so you know, so I definitely wanted to have this nice and tight here. So here I am looking at it, and I actually really do like the width of this, so I'm going to keep it. I'm going to be moving on to my bias tape. So I had to make my bias tape for this, and so you're always going to be cutting at a 45-degree angle with your fabric, and you can see that angle right here. This gives a little stretch to it and is perfect for bias tape and binding. And then I'm ironed it in half, and then I'm going to be bringing the edges to the center and ironing it. I did add a little starch to make sure that these little pieces stayed in nice and tight. So remember, with bias tape, what you're doing is you're just bringing in the edges and then you're going to be sewing it flat, whereas with binding, you're going to be folding it and then folding it again. So it should end up looking like this for your bias tape. Now we're going to be moving on to the rest of our case. And so I have the outside fabric with the lining fabric together, and I'm just making a rectangle that is 4 inches by 13 inches long. And I want this to be folding over because I'm using iron-on fusible fleece as the interfacing, which is not a little, it is very thick, and it's going to give that protective layer for our glass case. And when you have a bottom seam, it can just get too thick on those corners. So let's move on to the flap, and here's that little pattern piece. So you can make this a little thinner or however you would like to. Really look at some inspiration and kind of decide on what you would like this flap to look like, and then draft how you would like it. Just remember your seam allowance. So now we're going to be moving on to the outside fabric, and I'm going to need to make some binding to go in with the clip. So this is for me 3.5 inches, and that's going to give me a 3/4 inch binding, and so that's what I'm going to be cutting here. And then this piece right here is my fabric on fold, and you can see I'm cutting it again at that 3.5 inches, and this is actually the lanyard part. So I actually measured around my neck to my chest, and I ended up with about, I want to say about 28 inches. So I'm going to cut this 14 inches long unfold and then 3.5 inches wide. But I do suggest you measure because I want this at my chest, but I don't want it too low because the glasses case is going to be attaching. So take your measuring tape and just measure it down to where you like it, and then you can go from there. And then to complete the lanyard, I'm going to need a D-ring. Now let's do the inventory for the actual glass case. And so here I have both my liner and my outside fabric. And again, these are cut at 4 inches wide, 13 inches long, and then I have both pieces of my flap, the liner and the outside fabric, and then I have the binding piece to hold on that clip, and then here are my sew-on clasps. I was trying to decide if I wanted a button on the fabric or if I wanted to do a bow. I am deciding a bow, and then this is the fusible fleece right here. And that's what I'm going to use to stabilize my outside fabric to help give a little protection. So I took the fusible fleece as well as outside fabric over to my iron and I ironed them together. And then I needed interfacing on my flaps, so I cut some of that as well. And then I took that to the iron and got that attached. So everything's kind of coming together and I feel like you can kind of see how all the pieces work. Now let's get to the sewing portion. So here is my liner and I'm just going to be sewing down again 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm going to back stitch on the top and I'm just sewing straight down my fabric. Now when I come to about 1/2 inch from that bottom, you're gonna see I'm gonna start curving my fabric. And this is just so I don't have blunt ends. And so you just curve it at that last 1/2 inch, not too much, and it prevents those ends from poking out. I just wanted a nice smooth bottom, but I didn't want to draft that into the pattern because I started with a rectangle and that seemed really easy. So here we're just going to be sewing down the other side as well. I'm going to show you how I do that little curve one more time. Just remember your fingers are really close, so make sure that your fingers are firmly on your metal plate. If they're anywhere near your presser foot, that will keep from having any accidents. So here's that binding piece that we're going to be adding on the clip to, and you can see that I've already ironed it and got everything nice and crisp. And now I'm going to be doing the top stitching, and I have a 1/8 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to be sewing both sides of this. So it's going to look it's going to look more like a belt loop, and that is exactly what I'm going for because I know it's going to be nice and sturdy to hold on to that hardware. So once you get done with one side, I always like to start on the side that's folded together, and then I like to top stitch on the side that's just ironed down flat. And you want to just make sure you back stitch here. This is a little bit longer than I actually need, but again, I'm trying to overestimate on some of these things because I know that once it's too small, it's just a lot harder to go back and redo everything. And you can see what that looks like together right here. And I wanted to make sure that this is exactly 3/4 inch because that was how wide my hardware is, both the D-ring and this. So that's the reason why. So if yours are smaller or wider, you might want to adjust how much you do. So here we're going to be adding on that liner to the flap, and you just want to make sure that you're sewing around the curves. And you know what? I ended up doing a smaller seam allowance here because it was too hard to go around the curve of the 1/2 inch. I'm for sure you know what I'm talking about. And so I did the seam allowance along the side of my presser foot, and this presser foot is a little wider than normal, but I love it. So you can adjust. It is 3/8 inch seam allowance right here, and it ended up working out really well. So you can kind of do the math, kind of decide and see what's going to work out best for you. Sometimes those curves are so hard to keep the perfect seam allowance. And so once I've sewed up both the sides and the bottom, I can sew up the corners. And then we're going to clip our edges, and then we can turn out inside out. So, this wasn't too hard. I think just as long as you have this shape or you have seen inspiration of the shape that you want, it's really easy to draft this, like I said before. And so you're going to clip those corners, and then you can turn it right sides out, and you can kind of see what it's going to look like here. And then I took it over to the iron to make sure it was nice and ironed flat. And then I did a 1/8 seam allowance just along the outside edge. And you can see that right here. So it's all nice and top stitched. So I love the look of this already. Okay. Now we're going to take the outside fabric with that fleece on it, and we're just going to sew up the side seams. And we're going to do the exact same thing that we did with the liner. We're going to make sure it's nice and backstitched, and then when we get to the edge, we're going to make, when it's about 1/2 inch from the edge, that's when we are going to just curve it inwards to protect having those corners just be nice and sharp. So again, we're going to backstitch here, so down the side, 1/2 inch seam allowance, 1/2 inch to the end. Then we're just going to curve it with our fingers attached to our sewing machine, so we do not sew over our fingers. And then we're just going to clip off any excess fabric you may have here. And then when it comes to those corners, I could leave it just a little bit. And you want to make sure you don't cut the seam, because once you do, it's going to be it's not going to be fun. So you just want to get rid of the excess and then just make tiny little snips where it curves. So that way it'll curve a little bit nicer. This is just so thick at this point that you need all the little help that you can get. Just don't snip through the thread. I know, that's like the scariest part. And then we're going to turn this inside right sides out, and you can see right here, it's just already coming together. And so here it is with the flap, and then we can add on that little ring, and you're going to be able to see how it is. So this is very important to get the order of operations correct. So we want to make sure that our flap is right sides together, but before we can attach our flap, we need to have that binding piece with our hardware on it in between the flap and the actual case. And so that's all clipped here together. So first you're going to attach your hardware binding, and then you're going to attach your flap with right sides together and wrong side up on the flap. And here we're just basting all this together to make sure that we have it attached before we add that bias tape on the inside. So this is what it's looking right now, and you can see how everything is where I want it. And then we're going to be adding in the liner. And then we move on to the sewing in tight places. And this really is. And what we're sewing on is that bias tape right here. So I'm trying to get it onto the inside fabric with right sides together. This is a little bit better view right here. And you're just going to be opening it up and sewing on the iron mark. And so our right side, the outside of our case, just because you want to have the side that you're sewing on folded in. So my case is turned inside out one more time, and then I have the bias tape here, and I'm just sewing on the iron mark, and I just sew a little bit, and then I readjust my case, sew a little bit, and readjust my case. But you're going to be flipping this case inside and outside just a couple more times to get this all correct. I found it just easier to sew on the inside of my case, and so that's why I flipped it. And again, you're just going to be slowly just going here because it's such a tight space. It was just like sewing a tiny baby armhole. It's just really little. And then we're going to be flipping that bias tape over and top stitching it. But we can't top stitch it from the outside. So we're going to trim up everything, and then we're going to have to flip it one more time. So here we are, and you can see how it's looking. And then I can trim up the extra of the bias tape. I just would rather have it long. Again, I just rather have it long. And you see I have turned it outside, right sides out. And so this is so I can fold over, and so I have nice, beautiful finished edges on the inside of this case, and I'm just going to have to stitch it down. And so you can see I have it flipped so I can sew on the inside of the case, and we are just playing that very fun game of sewing in tight places. And I know that's your favorite, and we're going to just be stitching this all the way around. And this is, with this seam allowance, it's probably about a 3/8 seam allowance, and we're just going to be sewing it. This was so much fun. You can see how much fun I'm having trying to wiggle this case around. For me, it's worth it. I really love having really nice finished edges, so I don't mind taking the time here to make sure that everything is top stitched and I have that bias tape instead of having it look sloppy. So let's move on to our lanyard, and this is going to go really quick. This is just a very easy lanyard to make. So we have our long strip of fabric, and we're just going to be ironing it in half, and then we're going to be bringing in the sides to that half iron line. And this is just essentially making a giant piece of binding. So you're going to be folding it in, and then you're going to be ironing it down, with both pieces coming to the inside and then just ironing it flat. And then you get to fold this yet again in half. And then that is going to be our piece of fabric that's going to go around our neck, and that's going to create our lanyard. And here I am just quickly top stitching it with a 1/8 seam allowance, just like I did for that piece of hardware. And then here is the D-ring that is going to attach the case. So you're going to bring your two pieces of your lanyard together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and just sew across, making sure that you back stitch at both ends because we do not want this coming undone. And then when we flip it, we're going to pull that D-ring down and then close it together with that D-ring in the center. And right here, it's about probably 3/4 of an inch right here that I'm just sewing it together. So it has all those encased, and then it has that D-ring there at the bottom. I just want to make sure that those raw edges are nice and in and tight. So I decided to try a bow here, but a button would work, or if you have snaps, that would probably work the best. But this is what I had, and I felt the bow is very in style, so I decided to give it a try. So I'm just tied a bow and I'm sewing it on. And this is to hide the stitches that I'm going to do to add on that sew on magnetic clasps, and then it will just help make it look nice and finished, and you won't be seeing any stitch marks, just a cute little black bow. And here I am sewing on those clasps. And you're just going to attach them. I really like them. They're easy, they work. But again, there are better options. If you make a lot of bags, you probably have those options in your supply. But here we are just trying to make do. And that's sometimes what we do as sewists, right? And that's what's been so fun about this series, is that I'm doing things that I normally don't do and trying to find solutions. So this is how it turned out with the clasp, and I just have to say, I do like this. It fits perfect with the glasses, and it's so nice to have this just so easy. Like, I feel like the glasses are just right there with me. I honestly wouldn't have thought to put a case on a lanyard, but now that I have, I think it makes an excellent gift for those who have reading glasses. This was such a fun sew. I hope you give it a try.
I love how this turned out. It's so adorable. She wanted something stylish, and depending on the different fabrics you choose, you can even do a batting and have it nice and quilted. Really, this is something that you can really design however you would like to. It's nice, it's simple, and it holds the glasses in nice and tight. So that's really nice. You can also do snaps instead of doing the magnetic closure. My husband was just telling me, he goes, "We need to get you some of those fun snaps and things the other day." And I didn't get a kit or anything. So it's a little late for that now. But I do love how this turned out. Now, with this being sewn, there's no quick release. So if you are like a slide tester, or if you work in a medical field or around machinery, I do suggest getting a lanyard that has an easy release, because this does not. So make sure you're careful out there. And before I let you go, thank you guys so much for all your birthday well wishes and comments. I really appreciate it. And as you can see, I really love your comments. We love doing these little challenges with you, especially with this accessibility. This is so wonderful. Our accessibility series has been such a challenge and so rewarding to do so much research and try to figure out the best way to make sure that the things that we sew also can be very helpful. So thank you again. We appreciate you for watching, and a like and subscribe would be a wonderful. Happy sewing, and I'll catch you next time.